Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this Inevitable Policy Response Planet Tracker webinar. Can food companies sustain and grow their value? And we're delighted to have Profundo contributing to this webinar as well. So very good afternoon to all of you, or good morning, depending upon where you're joining us from. I'm joined this afternoon by a number of very august panelists. My name is Peter Elwin. I'm the Director of Fixed Income and Head of the Food and Land Use at Planet Tracker. And I'm joined by a colleague of mine, Filippo Grassi, who is our data analyst, one of the data analysts in our data analyst team at Planet Tracker. And he's going to be talking about our work on nature-dependent exporters, which is a really fascinating piece of research and an ongoing project that we have. Following on from him, I'm delighted to welcome Barbara Cooper and her colleague Gerard Riech. Barbara and Gerard are both from Profundo. Barbara is a sustainable supply chains expert and Gerard is an equity analyst at Profundo. They're going to be talking about their really interesting report, which has been looking at companies in the soy supply chain and the extent to which they are exposed to, particularly to sort of soy coming out of Brazil. And then finally, we're going to finish up with Jason Ice, who's an executive director at Vivid Economics. Vivid is one of the organizations that's been providing a lot of help and input to the inevitable policy response, doing a lot of the modeling and the sort of underlying econometric work behind that process. And he's going to be talking about the work that they've been doing on land use and land use change and the implications of a policy response to that as one of the core sources of human GHG emissions. So a fascinating session. There will be time for questions at the end. If you have a question, we won't be able to sort of interrupt as we go, but do pop it into the Q&A box, not the general chat. Pop it into the question and answer section, and we'll pick up as many questions as we can at the end. If we can't address them on this webinar, because we've only got 60 minutes, then we will make sure that we get back to you afterwards. So please do submit your questions through that Q&A function. And I think without any further ado, I should hand over to Filippo. So Filippo, I will close down my screen share and hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Welcome, everybody. Let me just screen share and I will start. Can you see?
Yep, you're good to go. Thanks, Filippo.
Thanks, Peter. Welcome, everybody. Thank you to the Government Foundation and the Finance Hub for partly financing this work. Nature is rising up the global markets agenda, and whether this is going to be natural capital or biodiversity, we believe it will end up alongside climate on the top of the list. The two are very closely interconnected. And so in today's presentation, we want to give a brief overview of the work that we've been doing on nature-dependent exporters. We're going to go through what they are, who they are, and why they are relevant in financial markets. Just quickly, we will just share a bit of background on the work that we've been doing in preparing our NDE dataset. We call it NDE for nature-dependent exporters. We'll show you some just taster of the findings of our work. There is a lot more in the report that we published a couple of weeks ago and in the dashboard that you can find on our website. And then I'll just go through some high-level conclusions at the end. It should be 12 minutes, less than 15-minute presentation in total. So what is an NDE? An NDE, we're looking at products which are processed but remained almost entirely made of materials that are harvested from nature. We're looking at goods that derive from nature, for example, crops. We recognize that all goods that are traded in the international market are at least partly dependent on nature. So we establish cutoff points of how to declare a good as nature dependent. The cutoff point is where a product is made, as I said, of materials that are harvested from nature, at least in the most part. So think of soy or sunflower oil, for example. I'll have a table in a couple of slides that will take you through a couple of more examples that should make it more clear. When a product is changed physically or chemically in a significant way, then we don't classify it as nature dependent anymore. For example, limestone, which is then converted into cement, or a vehicle, these are the sort of goods that we classify as not nature dependent. So we're looking at this from the point of view of countries and their level of exports of these nature dependent goods. So UN territories and countries and their level of natural resource exports. In the work that we did, we classified goods according to a definition of renewable or non-renewable goods. For today's presentation, renewable goods are much more relevant. They're quite closely aligned to soft commodities, and so that's what I'm going to focus on today. But just to let you know that if you check our website, you will find all the work that we did on non-renewable commodities as well. And you can see in the next slide roughly what these commodities are. We split countries into terciles. So there's three big groups of countries, each of the same size: high NDEs, medium NDEs, and low NDEs. So a high NDE will be a country that is highly dependent on these goods for their value of exports. Here are some goods and commodities that we classified as directly dependent on nature. You can see the commodities on the left, and then just focus on the middle column. For example, soybeans and seed and oil, we classified as renewable nature dependent. Fish preparations, flour, bread, even cotton and a t-shirt made of cotton, because it's made of materials that are harvested from nature, we classify as directly dependent on nature. And then if you scroll down further on the list, you can see some other commodities which are not in the definition that we're going to talk about today, even though some will be in the definition of non-renewable nature-dependent commodities. So just a very brief overview of the work that we did. There was a lot of work that went into this over many months. We start from Comtrade, which is a UN database of trade. 99% of the world merchandise trade is registered in Comtrade. And then the data is actually prepared and cleaned up by CEPI, which is a leading French center for research on the world economy and trade. And then we take their data set and we classify 5,000 products into whether they are renewable nature dependent, non-renewable nature dependent, or not dependent on nature at all. We have other classifications that we prepared for the same data sets that we are doing more work on. So as Peter said, this is ongoing work, and there's more work that will come up in the future, in the near future. So what we end up with, which is relevant for today, is these NDE categories. As I said, high, medium, and low nature-dependent exporters. These are countries that are dependent on nature for their exports. Just a couple of words on why this is important, and we thought it was worth undertaking this analysis. As I said, nature is rising up the global agenda. We need to examine sovereign's dependence on nature, and we believe that this could give us insights into the future, into how these countries can evolve. And we believe that understanding common characteristics between, for example, high nature-dependent exporters can give us some forecasting power in this analysis. So which countries are high nature-dependent exporters? You can focus, this is the map, this is the result of the work that we did. You can see the high NDEs in dark green in the map. You can focus on, for example, Brazil, Argentina, according to our definition, we classify as high nature-dependent exporters. For example, Iceland and Greenland are also high nature-dependent exporters, as well as, for example, New Zealand and some countries in the Horn of Africa and other countries dotted around, as you can see. And we also did work and looked at common characteristics between, for example, the countries in red, low NDEs, and medium NDEs in light green.
Filippo, just before you continue, I'm afraid your connection is a little bit wobbly. Do you think you could turn your camera off? That will probably improve the audio.
Sure. Sorry about that.
No, your fault.
Video.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. Can you see which countries are high, medium, low NDEs table?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So this is just a table that gives you a quick overview of the 10 most renewable nature-dependent exports. Countries are usually small countries, as you can see, Falkland Islands, Micronesia, or territories, I should say, Kiribati, but you can see Uruguay makes the top 10 list. And the type of commodity they export the most, and most interestingly, the actual NDE share, so the percentage of total exports that is dependent on nature. You can see these numbers are astonishingly high. We're talking above 90% of total exports, some dependent on nature. And the other thing that I would like to point attention to is that many of these are small islands, which we've category to we did. The average of nature-dependent export down consistently since the first year, 2020.
Filippo, hi. I'm sorry, your audio is failing badly at the moment. So
I'm very sorry.
No problem at all. Let's just see what we can do about that.
If I talk more slowly, would that help?
Yes, that was definitely a little bit better just then, but I think it's your internet connection that's the problem. Let's just keep going for a minute or two and see if it improves. Otherwise, I'll take over.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll try and talk more slowly, say less, let the slides speak, if that helps. The G8 and the rest of the world are in this slide. You can see that the G8 has lower levels of nature-dependent exports throughout. And the next slide, there's only 4 slides left really here, so it's almost finished. The bulk of the work that we did was to go through some characteristics that these countries share. If you look on the left, there's 6 categories that we looked at. For example, population resource dynamics. The measures used in that category, for example, were population size, population density, and national land area. And we run regressions on each of these measures against our own metric of nature-dependent exports. And the main conclusions are in the report. I will just take you through 2 of these categories and just share the main conclusions. I will talk about land tenure and financial access in 2 slides, and then summarize some conclusions for social stability, domestic income, and long-term influences. So for land tenure, as I said, the measures that we assessed were the country, and you can can draw from our single regressions that we carried out is that renewable nature-dependent or resource exporters have worse soil erosion and less water stress. So this is both worrying and comforting in two ways. For more information, we try to explore the causal link between some of these characteristics. We don't have time for that here, so I'll again point you to the main paper where you can have more detailed analysis of this. The next one is financial access. We only had one measure assessed here, which is the sovereign credit rating. There is a lot more work to do here, which we are currently doing, to include more measures. The main conclusion, interestingly, was that credit ratings of both renewable and non-renewable high nature-dependent exporters are poorer on average. So they have a lower score in a lower credit rating in both renewable and non-renewable categories. And then last slide, hopefully you've been able to catch a bit more of what I was explaining. I'm just going to mainly read out the main conclusions across the 6 characteristics. So for 6 countries, over 90% of their exports comes from renewable resources. You've seen that in one of the first slides. Many small island states are heavily invested in renewable resources for their exports. Which are 12 measures that we looked at, their improvement results in reduced renewable resource dependence. And likewise, less inequality and greater GDP per capita lead to decreasing renewable exports. As we just saw, soil erosion and water stress are both, for soil erosion is worse, for water stress is better. The relationship and the credit ratings, we said both for renewable and non-renewable HNDs, they have a poorer score. And the last 2 metrics that we looked at are patent applications and climate resilience, and we can see they are negatively related to NDEs. And that's my slide. So thank you. I'm hoping that a bit more of what I said in the later stages. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Filippo. Yes, and apologies about the audio quality there. I'm afraid the internet connection was a little bit rocky. Filippo, if you can take your slides off, that would be fantastic. Now I'd like to hand over to Barbara. Barbara is going to talk about the really interesting work that Profundo has been doing on supply chains, and particularly looking at how profit is distributed and the materiality of exposure to negative sustainability impacts. Barbara, over to you and Gerard.
Thank you, Peter. Well, I hope my connection is a bit clearer. So we're going to talk briefly through a project that was also commissioned by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation through the Finance Hub, looking at the materiality of exposure to negative sustainability impacts with a focus on beef and soy from Latin America. So the objective was to assess this materiality based on a selection of 10 downstream actors that are exposed to these 2 supply chains. So to first briefly look at how we estimated the supply chain exposure to these forest risk commodities. The companies that we included in the selection are, I have to say, not representative in that group of 10. So it's not, the results don't allow to draw broader conclusions and extrapolate results at this point. We chose companies that have significant inputs of soft commodities, and then specifically soy and or beef from Latin America, leading branded goods producers, retailers, and food service companies. And yeah, we chose publicly listed companies because that allows for a bit more access to business related data. So the companies that you see here were included in this analysis. They are all active at the downstream end of the supply chains, but some of them also are vertically integrated along the whole chain and the different steps, which means that there is a potential for some double counting because there may be supply chain relationships between some of these companies. So what the approach that we used was to estimate country level origin of soy and beef. So we did not consider specific biomes, for example, in Brazil, say the Amazon or the Cerrado. And we also did not consider, for example, that part of these supplies may fall under voluntary commitments or, for example, be sourced under deforestation or conversion-free criteria, because none of these allow us at this point in time to use traceability data, transparency, or disclosure by companies. We searched for information in company publications, in disclosure under the CDP reporting, or RTIS, the Roundtable on Responsible Soy, for example, in media articles. So we looked across a whole broad range of potential data sources. And we also contacted the companies themselves, of which some reacted and also were willing to have discussions, but again, not providing us with the data and the level of detail that we were looking for. So that means that we had to use an alternative approach of making basically extrapolations and assumptions based on the data that we could find. I thought I'll show you one example of what that could look like in one of the most complicated cases, being McDonald's. The company discloses estimates for embedded soy in chicken and their total beef use. They do not provide soy volumes for other relevant products or the share of what likely is sourced from Latin America in beef, neither for beef nor for soy. Therefore, the estimates that we used were based on various pieces of data that some of these examples are listed here. So for pork, we used the US pork consumption, which has been disclosed, the US egg consumption, German milk consumption, and beef from several regions. And we then extrapolated that across the whole company. And for soy, in turn, then applied average shares of embedded soy per product unit and a breakdown of geographic origin of commodities that are used in different parts of the world. So you see that there are a lot of levels of estimates involved, but it's the best that can be done, probably based on the lack of really comprehensive disclosure of data. Well, yeah, as I said, the data comparability is then another level of difficulty because the supply chains are, in parts at least, very complicated. There are differing and often unclear methods for estimating where companies are disclosing numbers. You can also see that sometimes the volumes differ considerably from one year to the other, which is partly also impacted by new methods or better estimates. There's in some cases, like, for example, shown for McDonald's, incomplete product coverage. So you may find figures for some part of their product portfolio, but not for others. And there's usually, or in many cases, a lack of origin information. So that means that inconsistencies are inherent to this methodology, and we may look at over or underestimates in several of the cases. But overall, we think that this is a way of getting close to reality and to base our following analysis on these results, for which I'm now handing over to Gerard to look at the methodology that we used for that.
Yes, thank you very much, Barbara. Well, the complex work which is done by Barbara is very essential to calculate the financial materiality of the beef, of the embedded beef and embedded soy from Latin America. And the transparency on profits made on these two products is supportive to very supportive to stakeholders. to understand the knowledge of the exposure, the monetary exposure to Latin American soy and beef, the embedded soy and beef. It's an enabler of discussions. When you know how much a company is earning on embedded Latin American soy and beef, it gives ground to some discussion for fairness of distribution of costs related to execution of zero deforestation policies. For companies, it's very important. What is for stakeholders, for shareholders, finances? It's important. What is the responsibility level for a company? How much can they contribute? And thirdly, the operating profit value from on embedded soy and embedded beef. It's for us an input, a very crucial input for calculating the reputation value of a company which might be affected. Next slide, please. Well, by far the preferred route, of course, would be that you call the company and they or you mail the company and they provide the value of the gross and operating profit, or even better, all the payments to financiers made on beef and embedded soy. That would be by far the preferred route. However, the problem is that companies have no accounting system separately for each input material, so they don't know how much profit they make on embedded plastic, on embedded soy, on embedded beef, etc. And there is also no obligation for this to have this kind of accounting in place. So that's why we moved to the second best solution, and that is just apply the available relevant gross and operating margin on the priced up embedded soy or beef product. And for that, you need to know, of course, the sourcing price. We know the volumes now. That's what Barbara did, calculated. But now we need to know the sourcing price per ton. And that's why the next step is quite crucial. So that's on the next slide. So which input price to use? And that's necessary to calculate, to apply the gross margin that this company is generating on embedded soy or embedded beef, and to apply the operating margin on the beef. So if we look to the every step in the supply chain, the value of soy or beef gets higher. And an example is for soy meal. Here it's based on a few countries, and so the world price is 481. But every step that is made from to trader cruncher to animal feed company to mid downstream animal product company and to retailer and food service company, you see an uptick in the value of the embedded soy and in the end we arrive at after pricing up, even a retailer finally is selling it for $1,450 per ton. That was based on the $481 per ton, and that was the world price of soy. So that's every time it's moving up, and also every time the added value becomes larger, and that's very crucial, taking into account how McDonald's is doing. You will see that later on. In total, the soy meal index is moving up from 1 to 3, and for beef, exactly the same story. You have much fewer steps. But then the move is from 1 to 1.64. 1 is the 5,000 is the global price, and 8,000 is the price at the retail level. Next slide, please. Example: we have JBS. We have two examples, JBS and McDonald's. For beef, we know that the sales price is known already, and we can calculate the net revenue they make on the embedded beef and the gross profit and the operating, all based on the gross margin of 18.9% and the operating margin of the company of 10.4%. That's how we did it for beef. For soy, we used the 669. That's the input price level from the animal feed company. We applied the pricing up. That's based on the on the gross profit margin, and then you come to net revenue to gross profit. Again, apply the 18.9%, and you come to the operating profit, applying the 10.4%. And in total, you see that this company is generating in operating profit terms more than $1 billion on embedded beef and on embedded soy, with the majority from embedded beef. And that is around 17.5% of the, and that's on the first row of the global operations of this company. That is 6.8 billion. So 17.5% is linked to Latin American based embedded soy and beef. Next slide, please. If you look to McDonald's, we did exactly the same. McDonald's is very large in a large sourcer of global beef production. Around more than 1% of the global beef production is sourced by this company. But if we do exactly the same for McDonald's as we did with JBS, we arrive at that in total there is an operating profit on embedded soy and embedded beef of $1.72 million, and that's in total around 14% of the global operating profit. So that is quite material, which can be linked to Latin American embedded beef and soy. Next slide, please. Next slide. If you go to the total outcomes, this is only for Latin American soy. The 10 companies, they are responsible for around 14 million tons of embedded Latin American soy meal, and that's around 9% of total Latin American soy meal. So that's quite substantial, only through 10 companies. And if you here look at the operating profit of these companies in total, that's 1.5 billion on embedded Latin American soy. And if you look very interesting, slide before, if you look to the operating profit per ton, you see the wide differences. McDonald's making much more profit on embedded per ton on embedded soy than, for instance, CPF is making. So that's because of the enormous high margin that McDonald's is able to apply to every input material that they use. Next slide, please. For beef, this is the summary. In total, 5 companies could be linked to Latin American beef, and they had of this 10 which were selected, 18.3% they are responsible for, but of course the majority is from JBS. And in total, they generate $1.7 billion on operating profit here. And also here you can see the operating profit per ton is quite different. Next slide, please. The total, the conclusion is that you can see that there are some companies are very material, can be very financially material linked to Latin America soy and beef. It's Brazilian food, JBS, CPF, McDonald's, and Yum China. And you can see that the companies which have a very diversified portfolio, like the retailers and like Nestle, they have very low percentages that can be linked of their global operating profit to Latin American soy and beef. Next slide, please. I will keep it short because of time reasons. Well, it's the supply chain mapping. Barbara already clearly said it. It's about lack of data availability, transparency, and the profit chain methodology. It's the second best solution. There is not a better solution here to calculate it. It's providing a lot of transparency for investors to engage, and the outcomes show really material exposure of some companies and their finance, and much more research should be done on other companies. This was only a group of 10 on from various levels in the supply chain. And the outcomes are an additional input for reputation risk calculation. So with this, I'd like to hand back to the moderator.
Thank you very much indeed, Gerard. That was a really fascinating presentation, and the report is well worth a look as well. The link's been put in the chat. So I'd like to that was very much, I feel like, a sort of a micro view focused on those 10 companies and that sort of specific supply chains of soy and beef coming particularly out of Brazil, Latin America more generally. I'd like to sort of broaden things out again now and hand over to Jason, who is going to talk us through the IPR's latest work looking at land use and land use change. So Jason, over to you. If you'd like to share your slides, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just getting my slides up now. Just give me 1 second. Okay, can you now see my slides? Let me put it on.
You're showing us just the normal slide view at the moment.
Okay, there we go. And I think I've probably got to get my view is still, you're seeing the
and then you need to switch the display
yes,
settings to show us the presenter.
Yeah, so I'm doing that right now. Oh, sorry, just 1 second. Sorry about that. Just give me 1 second. I had.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, excellent. Terrific. Well, good afternoon, everybody. So kind of in complement and similar to some of the previous speakers, I'm going to present work that we've been leading with PRI around the inevitable policy response initiative. And just for people to understand a bit of background, since 2018, the IPR initiative has been kind of commissioned by PRI with the aim of providing investors, and I guess the financial sector in general, a better understanding of some of the risks and opportunities that might come out of the transition. It's been supported by a group of research partners, of which we, Vivid Economics, are one of them, but also a whole variety of others, including our friends at Planet Tracker. And it's been also given kind of in-depth input from a number of kind of leading strategic partners in the industry. In terms of what we've done more broadly, the work of IPR attempts to understand what possible trajectories there might be for the transition, what kind of policy scenarios might lead to the types of risks that we've just been talking about with regards to exposure to land and natural resources. And it's to do this, it's developed a very detailed set of scenarios that investors can look at to understand what the risk drivers are, and then look at some of the implications for their investment strategies and investment risk management. What we've tried to do in this piece of work that I'm going to talk about now is to get into how an investor might understand supply chain risk. And having done work on this since 2018, I guess what we found, and the reason we conducted this work, was that was quite poorly understood, these types of supply chain risks, and that there was a sort of a crucial gap in the way transition risk scenario analysis was being done by financial institutions. The work that we'd done to date had been largely focused on land use value drivers upstream only, and not through the entire supply chain. And this work is attempting to help close that gap in a spirit quite similar to the other presenters. So what are we trying to do with this work? We're trying to understand how the sort of deforestation driven by tropical soft commodities creates risk across the supply chain, similar to what we've heard earlier. Doing that through understanding how those risks move from some of the upstream deforestation occurring directly through international trade to those who are dependent on those commodities, and essentially to give a realistic sense of how changes in the policy environment over time will see these risks moving into material impacts for downstream companies, as pressure on these companies increases to demonstrate greater environmental sustainability, and as policy stringency increases. So that's the kind of the aim and objective of the work. The way we undertook the work and the kind of outputs I'll talk you through a little bit was to go step by step to help investors understand what drives the risk, how does that risk manifest itself in a set of drivers, and then how would you apply that to understand risk exposure to specific companies. So that includes a module that looks at the kind of policy mapping. What do we know about where the policy landscape is in terms of regulating production and trade of soft commodities? What are the policy triggers that are meaning that ways of production with deforestation are turning into material risks for companies? What do those risks look like when as they unfold with increasing policy stringency? How do they manifest in terms of levels of production in different regions, prices of the commodities that get traded, and the exposure across in different jurisdictional combinations? So those exporting and those importing across different scenarios. And then finally, what we tried to do is provide a bit of a framework for how investors could then assess the impact of those risk drivers, specifically on different companies, given the kind of data available. So let me talk you through how we've approached this topic and how I think it supplements some of what was presented earlier. So what sort of to start with, why this ends up being important for investors to consider. I think it's important to recognize, as emphasized a bit earlier, that tropical soft commodities drive a huge amount of deforestation. From a kind of a corporate and investor perspective, this means that a lot of these downstream companies are associated with significant, scope 3 emissions and negative nature impacts, and that creates financial risk, and it also makes it difficult to meet a number of corporate targets for alignment to decarbonization trajectory. These supply chains, are dependent quite a lot on international trade, which means that upstream deforestation in a few jurisdictions actually drive direct and indirect risk downstream globally. And as we'll see in some of the analysis, our assessment of the kind of quote unquote inevitable policy response includes significant policy action, and we can see that in some of the commitments and unfolding policies, both in exporting and importing countries, which really exacerbates the risk for these companies. And as pressures increasing and companies are more and more required to disclose these environmental impacts, one will see, and I think investors will see this coming increasingly into consideration when it comes to the valuation of these companies. So let me take you through sort of how that worked. I won't go through the details of the methodology now. People can look at that later. But if we look sort of, how has this unfolded in terms of the analysis we've done, and what's kind of now available through the IPR initiative. First of all, just in terms of the drivers of this risk, what we've noted, and you can find in kind of documented in good detail, is that a lot of the producing and importing countries have committed to stopping deforestation. Policies have become more and more stringent, and they seem poised to continue in that trend, given what we know about commitments. On the left, you can see the number of countries that have started to reach policy commitment levels that are quite material. 5 being the highest score, 0 being the lowest, but you've now got many countries that have moved from very little by way of policy commitments to quite full and robust policy commitments. You can see on the right, this includes things like NDC commitments, communication of long-term strategies, the consideration of targets for avoided deforestation and zero deforestation pledges. A total of 88% of countries have made commitments, either in climate or forestry, and 67 have committed specifically to reduce or eliminate deforestation. Quite importantly, I think from a risk perspective, and we'll get into this, leading importing regions, such as the EU, the UK, US, Canada, China, Japan, have implemented or committed to climate or deforestation related policies, which creates a risk through that export-import relationship, and puts further pressure on those companies sort of located in those importing regions in terms of the kinds of risks they might face. At the same time, in FPS, in the scenario that we've done, deforestation is expected to start to come down quite quickly. That actually means that the commodities linked to deforestation are likely to represent or be associated with particularly big risks. As pressure on deforestation activities ramps up, it actually means that, especially over the next 5, 10, maybe 15 years, any companies that are kind of associated with deforestation will come under much more significant pressure. So I think the idea is to say that in some ways, the faster this transition hits and the more countries crack down on deforestation, the more we'll see these risks manifest. You can see, so countries with the current levels of high deforestation, represent the highest risk. This goes across commodities. Beef, of course, drives a large proportion of the deforestation, but a large number of commodities are associated in one way or another with deforestation, and will be facing the risk as these policies increase. What we've done then to kind of help understand how these risks will become manifest is set up what we call a risk exposure framework. This framework defines a number of categories of risk, and I'll just walk through them quite quickly. These include the sort of direct risk of having to purchase these commodities and the possible changes in cost to these commodities from carbon, the carbon impact being internalized. But it also includes, quite importantly, risks to art market access. If your product is associated with deforestation, you might have trouble importing it or selling it in certain markets. It includes possible fines in jurisdictions of operation where companies are seen as non-compliant with increasing rules. It also includes increase to cost of capital as companies may need to adjust their methods of production and pass those costs on. For some companies, the transition will also mean shifts in the demand for their products, and it may also mean, if you're associated with deforestation, reputational risk that can affect not just the product that's directly dependent on that tropical commodity, but actually your entire product set. So there's a whole set of transition mechanisms and aspects of exposure that we think it's important for investors to take in mind, and that we've created a framework by which you can start to estimate those impacts. How does it get implemented? So we've done now a couple of pilots on how investors can estimate some of these impacts. I'll give you a sense of the kind of steps here, and I'll show you some of the results before I kind of conclude. But basically, what's important to do, and I think we've seen this in the previous analysis by Profundo and Planet Tracker, is of course to understand the company itself and where its exposure might lie, particularly from the perspective of where it's procuring. But also whether it's actually taken action or is cognizant of the need to assure deforestation-free procurement. Depending on what information is available, a lot of it's not publicly available, but the companies themselves should have this information, trying to understand the volumes and regions of procurement quite clearly. Then look at whether its exposure and its understanding of its exposure is high or not, depending on the kind of value drivers that we've created. Are they procuring from countries at significant risk of currently holding a lot of deforestation? Are they in regions in which policy is going to be getting more stringent, and what are the kind of impacts that might have? And then using the value drivers that we've estimated to understand the actual impact on costs and revenues that might come from this. We then sort of demonstrate how you might calculate that and what a company might need to do, what kind of the overall exposure might be if a company doesn't do anything to mitigate that exposure, and then what it might need to do and how much it might cost to actually deal with the exposure, and what it might mean under a less how to put it, a less proactive or a more proactive stance by the company. And having kind of gone through that step-by-step understanding of how's the company currently aligned against different drivers of risk and what it might do, or what might happen if it did or did not seek to avoid those risks, you have good insights into how you might understand that risk exposure and deal with it as an investor, but also through engagement with the company itself to see if they can do a better job of managing these risks. So what kind of results have we seen? So we've now run a pilot of the analysis. We both did a deep dive pilot with investors that helped them kind of conduct the analysis themselves, and we then conducted the analysis on something like 40 different companies across the value chain. and we estimated not all risks. So this isn't sort of, you know, the full and last word on the subject, but we use the value drivers to estimate the policy related cost impacts, the demand impacts, the pass through of some costs through the supply chain, possible regulatory risks in terms of fines and things, and the reputational risk that might occur to a broader set of products. And as you can see, the impacts depend a little bit on where you are in the value chain. Some of the upstream companies face some of the biggest impacts, of course, like the agricultural products and commodities producers and the agricultural input companies, but actually downstream companies like food retailers, food and beverage manufacturers, restaurants and food service companies also face potentially significant value at risk exposure, you know, which could lead to a decrease in their overall net present value. This is a composite, so this is the average across a number of companies. When you look at it actually on a company by company basis, there's quite a lot of variation. So some of the companies that have, let's say, a worse footprint in terms of where they're procuring from, more exposure to deforesting regions and countries facing increasing policy stringency, could have impacts that are, you know, well above 10%, and in some parts of the supply chain, you know, even 20 to 25%, and the range of that exposure can be quite large. What we did find, however, is that there are actions that companies can take to mitigate those risks. While in some cases they are costly, on average, you know, companies taking action to assure that their supply chains are deforestation free, in particular, can actually eliminate most of the value at risk. There might be some costs that they still have to bear, but they can eliminate most of it. And for some companies, even it can be an opportunity. So there are possible opportunities of changing your product set. There are possibilities of getting a premium on being a more sustainable producer with a better reputation. So actually, you know, with positive action, this is not really necessarily a significant cost, and actually can lead to increases in value of some of those companies. So in conclusion, I think you know, policy impacts you know, can of course lead to value you know, value at risk on upstream, but also filter through to your downstream companies. You know, vulnerability will be changing as consumer preferences and policies shift. The important thing is to understand what that means in terms of your exposure across the supply chain. How do you start to manage the possible costs and avoid the exposure? And to think of this not just as something that is impacting your procurement, but also something that's going to broadly impact your reputational risk and your brand value in the market. So with that, let me stop sharing and hand back to you, Peter.
Thanks very much indeed, Jason. A really fascinating piece of work, and interesting to see how that sort of meshes with the work that Profundo has done. One question's come through on the chat, which I'll sort of actually fire back to you, Jason. But just to say to everybody that there will be a poll popping up on your screens before the close of the webinar, so please do fill that in. If you can take the time, it doesn't take very long to do, but really helpful to all of us to understand sort of what's useful and how to improve things going forward. But Jason, the question that's come through is saying, does the FPS or the 1.5 scenario assume carbon pricing from FOLU emissions? In other words, does it assume carbon pricing as a result of land use change, and particularly deforestation? And if so, sort of by when and what level? And second part of that question, does it consider non-CO2 emissions? And methane would be one very obvious one coming out of the food supply chain. Yeah.
So IPR does it. So it does consider all sources of emissions and policies that might regulate those emissions, including methane, but including also NOx and SOx, some of which are obviously pertinent to the agricultural supply chain with fertilizers and things like that. In terms of the sort of the assumptions around how policy will unfold, it's a combination. So there isn't necessarily a uniform set of policies. It depends on the jurisdiction. But what creates a carbon cost, I would say, is in some cases more, let's say, command and control restrictions on deforestation that mean that it is simply more difficult or impossible given enforcement of laws on deforestation to operate in a way that deforests. So it's not a carbon price per se, but it's implicitly imposing a carbon cost because it's not allowing deforestation. In some countries, it's more based on a kind of a carbon price or pricing set of policies where there are positive incentives to say reforest, and in many countries it's a combination of both at the end of the day. And it does show, I guess, overall, like in terms of its sort of expected trajectory, it does show a fairly significant increase in the number of carbon credits generated from NBS. So there is an expectation in those scenarios of market growth through, I guess, what you might call carbon pricing and carbon credit generation, but it's not that it relies solely on that or believes that's the only policy driver of change.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So just looking to see if there are other questions. We've running up close to the clock. Howard, I just wanted to quickly turn to you, if I may. Obviously, your analysis, you were using sort of company reported data to try and estimate, as you said you had to. How does your analysis sort of match up to what Jason was describing? Do you see sort of crossover there, or are they really taking a very different approach?
No, it's the input of Jason can be very helpful to estimate the future development on volumes and on costs, and let's say the impact of the increase of policy costs on the volume, and that really will help. And we already did it in one report that we made on JBS. It still needs to come out, but we used the vivid input on the impact of how the global meat demand will develop and what the impact will be on JBS. But as said, the report still has to be out, and that input is very helpful to calculate future cash flows of the companies and impacted by the costs. Yes.
Fantastic, and that's a really good plug and a cliffhanger to end on. So watch out for that next Profundo report, and you've seen the link in the chat to the IPR work that Vivid have been doing. So that is also out today as well. Time to wrap up, I'm afraid. We've run up against the hour. So just for me to thank all our panelists for their input. Please do feel free to make contact with each and every one of us if you've got follow-up questions. But I think the key message from today, really, from our perspective, is exactly as Jason was highlighting: policy changes coming. Countries are focusing on deforestation as one of the major sources of GHG emissions and harm to nature, and therefore one of the very obvious harms to tackle. And in theory, it's sort of simple. You don't have to do anything active. You just have to stop doing something bad. So I think we can be satisfied that that change will come from a policy perspective, maybe not as fast as some of us would like, but the path is inevitable, to copy Jason's brand, as it were. So we can expect that change to happen. And I think what you've seen from the work that both Vivid and Profundo have done, this will have quite strong impacts on companies, both those directly involved and also, very importantly, those further down the supply chain. So more work to be done, but definitely something for investors to pay close attention to. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for joining us on this webinar. The recording will be posted in the next couple of days, so you can listen back to that. And as I say, do get in touch if you have follow-up questions. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us.
Okay.